It was early 2002. I was hauling freight from Cincinnati, Ohio to Amarillo, Texas. 3 days on the road with a new co-driver named Rick. We split the driving, 10 or 11 hours each, sleeping in shifts in the bunk behind the seats, barely talking except for handovers. That day, it had been raining since noon, a steady, soaking rain that coated the road like oil. The sky had sunk into a dark gray early, the kind of color that makes headlights feel weak. We finished loading in Missouri and pulled out around 6 that evening. The rain didn't let up, just got heavier, and soon the surface of I-44 was a slick black mirror swallowing every beam of light. Rick went to the back before my shift ended, tossed out a half-joking threat about haunting me if I fell asleep and wrecked us, pulled the curtain shut, and disappeared, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the engine, the frantic slap of the wipers, and the glint of endless water running under us. I drove through mile after mile of empty, shining highway, the cab rocking gently in crosswinds, my hands tightening on the wheel every time the tires hissed over a deeper patch. 9 hours passed like a blur, my brain humming in that strange highway trance, where every sense is hyper-aware but half asleep. Around 3 in the morning, I eased into a small rest stop near Tulsa, low yellow lights glowing on wet asphalt. The only other vehicle, a lone pickup with its bed full of rainwater. I woke Rick, watched him shuffle forward with a steaming paper, cup of coffee that smelled burnt and bitter, his eyes barely open. We switched without a word. I collapsed into the bunk, tossed on an old comedy Liar Liar, and let the sound of Jim Carrey, mumbling through bad reception, drift me into unconsciousness. I was under for maybe half an hour when the scream yanked me out of sleep like a hook through the chest. Hold on, we're losing control. The curtain was still closed. My world just darkness and the smell of coffee in the air. But I felt it instantly, the weightless, gut-dropping sway of the cab tilting sideways, the vibration turning into a violent shudder then. For a split second, an eerie stillness, the silence before impact. My stomach rose into my throat. We were in the air. I didn't scream, didn't even breathe. I just curled against the floor, muscles locked, bracing for whatever was about to happen. The collision was an explosion that filled my skull, a single massive crack of metal, glass and thunder combined. The cab jerking sideways so hard my teeth slammed together, my ears ringing. The smell hit next diesel and hot rubber, the bitter sting of scorched brakes, the acrid taste of smoke sliding down my throat. Somewhere in the chaos, Rick's voice broke through, ragged, trembling, calling my name like he wasn't sure I'd answer. I forced my eyes open. The headlights were still faintly glowing, casting their dim beam into nothing. The cab was tilted to the left. Windshield caved in and splintered, Rick's seat gone. Just an empty space surrounded by shards. Blood smeared my arm, bright under the cabin light, but I couldn't tell if it was mine. I shoved at the passenger door until it gave way, dropped into thick mud that swallowed my socks instantly, knees buckling under the shock. The rain was still coming down hard, cold, heavy, stinging my face. I turned toward the road and the world stopped. Our truck was folded into the side of a small red CUV, crushed against the median barrier so hard its frame looked like wet paper. Smoke hissed from the hood, curling up into the darkness. A headlight dangled by a wire, flickering weakly before dying. Farther down the road, a few silhouettes were moving fast, beams of flashlights cutting through the rain, voices shouting for extinguishers. But every sound was muffled, distant, like I was underwater. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just stood there in the middle of it all, the cold soaking through my clothes, The guilt hitting before I even knew the details. The police came, their lights painting the wet pavement in red and blue, flashes that reflected in every puddle. Rick was still alive, broken ribs, busted shoulder, bleeding but conscious. I had nothing but scrapes and bruises. But the real wound came at the hospital when they told me 3 fatalities. A man, a woman, and their 6-year-old son. Gone instantly. No sirens could have made it in time. Rick told me later the tires had hit a sheet of standing water at just the wrong angle. Worn pavement turning it into a slick trap. The truck skating out of our lane, across the median, right into the path of the SUV. It took seconds, just seconds, for a normal night to turn into a wreck you don't walk away from in your head. I didn't drive at night for months. Couldn't make myself. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw the SUV's taillights swallowed by rain. The smashed roof, the smoke, and those first strangers running toward us with their faces set in shock. When I finally went back to that stretch of I-44, the road was smooth, resurfaced, reflective signs planted along the median. It was safer now, but the people it killed before the repairs. Nothing on that road would ever change that. It was a scorching afternoon, the sun hanging heavy over a stretch of desert. So empty it felt like the world had been erased. I was hours into my run, heading west with nothing on the road ahead but heat waves twisting the horizon. The dashboard clock read a little past 5, but the light outside was still bright enough to blind me if I looked anywhere but the road. The air conditioning was cranked high, barely keeping the heat from pressing in through the glass. A lukewarm energy drink sweating in my hand. My eyes were starting to blur from staring at the asphalt for so long when I rounded a gentle bend and saw it, an SUV. Sitting at an odd tilt off the roadside, nose sunk into a shallow ditch of sand. Every window shattered like it had been pelted with stones. The bodywork crumpled and caved in as if it had been rolled end over end. No movement. No sound, no dust, just that silent, broken shape in the middle of a desert with nothing else for miles. I slowed down, hazard lights clicking, the hum of the tires fading under me until I pulled up alongside. Stepping out was like walking into an oven, the heat blasting straight up from the pavement, through the sawloss of my shoes, the smell of scorched earth and burnt rubber already in the air. I grabbed a flashlight and the first aid kit without thinking, my body moving faster than my head, and walked toward the SUV. Up close, the damage looked worse, the windshield spider-webbed, the roof bowed slightly inward, the driver's side door hanging ajar. I leaned toward the opening and froze. A man was slumped in the driver's seat, his head turned sharply to the right, chin resting awkwardly on his shoulder. His hair was matted with blood, face pale under a sheen of sweat, eyes wide open and clouded over, fixed on nothing. His chest wasn't moving. The smell hit me hard, then copper from the blood. Sharp fumes from leaking gasoline, so strong I had to swallow to keep my stomach down. I stepped back, pulling my phone out of my pocket. Thumb already on the emergency call icon, but there was nothing, no signal. I moved toward the truck to grab the CB, static hissing back at me like an empty room. That was when I heard it soft. Almost nothing, a dull thud just behind me, followed by a hand clamping onto my shoulder. My body locked. There was no one else here. I spun around and felt my chest seize. A man stood inches from me, clothes soaked dark with blood, his hair clumped and stiff, his skin pale under streaks of dirt. His eyes, glassy, unblinking, were locked straight on mine. His torn blue shirt clung to him in strips, jeans stained with mud, a thin trail of blood crawling from his temple down his cheek. Every detail was identical to the man in the driver's seat. Same shirt, same hair, same face. I stumbled back, flashlight trembling in my hand, my mind stuttering between one impossible thought and another. Ghost, doppelganger, something not right. His lips moved, the words breaking in the middle. A whisper so dry, it was almost swallowed by the wind. Help me. He stepped forward, staggering like his legs barely remembered how to work. His eyes still fixed on me, the rims red like he'd been crying or like blood had pooled there. I turned to run, tripped in the sand, scrambled back to my feet. Behind me, I heard him collapse, the thump dull against the hot ground. My legs carried me toward the truck before I even decided to move. I wanted distance, wanted a barrier between me and whatever I'd just seen. But curiosity burned through the fear for a second, and I turned back toward the SUV. The man in the seat hadn't moved. His head was still twisted, eyes still vacant. Two men, same face. One alive, one dead, both here. I didn't go closer, didn't dare. I stood frozen between them, sweat sliding down my spine despite the heat's grip on the air. Minutes dragged like hours until a pickup truck appeared down the road, its shape rippling in the heat before it pulled up behind me. The driver was a middle-aged man with a lined face and sunburned skin. He took one look, his jaw tightening before he reached into the cab and pulled out a satellite phone. Emergency services were on their way before I even processed the words. 20 minutes later, the desert was filled with sirens. Paramedics swarmed the man on the ground, police peering into the wreck. They confirmed what I still couldn't wrap my head around. The survivor was the twin brother of the man in the car. They'd been driving together from Arizona. The tire had blown at high speed. The SUV lost control, rolled into the ditch. One brother had been thrown clear, alive but broken. The other had been pinned and didn't make it. Identical clothes, identical watches, identical everything. One of the officers told me if it had been anybody else, they'd swear they'd seen a ghost. I drove away hours later with my hazard lights still on, the heat shimmering off the hood, my chest tight with the memory of that touch on my shoulder and that voice dry, cracked, desperate asking for help in the middle of a dead desert. That night I didn't sleep. I've never driven long stretches through the desert without a satellite phone again, and I still can't close my eyes without seeing his face. The living one, the dead one, switching places in my mind until I don't know which one was looking at me. It was close to 11 at night at a remote truck stop-off highway, 85 in southern Arizona. I'd been on the road for 9 straight hours and needed a break, so I pulled into the farthest corner of the lot, away from the other rigs, where it was quiet and dark except for one flickering light pole in the distance. The place had a public restroom, a 24-hour convenience store with a single bored clerk inside, and maybe 3 other trucks scattered around. I shut off the engine, drew the curtains in the cab, turned on the small fan above the bed, and lay down, letting the hum of it blend into the wind whistling faintly outside. I didn't lock the doors. I can't tell you why. Habit was to reach up and flip the latch. But maybe I was too tired. Maybe I told myself it was a quiet place. Maybe I just didn't think about it. That was my first mistake. I shut my eyes, half asleep within minutes, drifting in that shallow space, where you're aware of the world but too heavy to move. The lot outside was silent except for the occasional metal groan of a truck cooling down after a long haul. Then I heard it faint, sharp, deliberate. A click, the sound of a door latch. Not a slam, not a rattle. A careful opening. At first, I told myself it was in my head, a sound from the store, the wind. But a few seconds later, I felt it movement inside the cab. Not the rumble of the fan, not the sway of the suspension. A soft, steady weight shifting on the steel floor. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, each one lighter than the last as they moved closer to the bunk. My heartbeat slowed to a painful thud in my chest, my breath shallow. My hand slipped under my pillow where I kept a folding knife, fingers curling around the handle without pulling it free yet. I didn't sit up. I didn't want to make a sound. The air felt thicker now, heavier, warmer. Then I heard it breathing. Not mine, steady, faint, close. I lifted the curtain just enough to see through a thin gap into the front cabin. Under the dim yellow haze leaking in from the streetlight, I saw him, a man, sitting in the passenger seat like he'd been waiting there for me to notice. His head bowed low so I couldn't see his eyes at first. His hair tangled and matted, his shoulders hunched. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there, a lifeless shape, his hands resting limp on his knees. I froze. I was sure there'd been no one in the lot when I parked. No one walking toward the truck. No knock, no sign, just the click, and now this. I pulled in a breath through my teeth, the sound too loud in the silence. That was when he turned his head toward me, slow, deliberate, his face coming into view under the light. Gaunt cheeks, wild eyes wide open and unblinking, lips slightly parted but saying nothing. He stared right at me through the curtain gap like he'd been watching for a long time. I bolted upright, pulled the knife free, and shouted, "Who the hell are you? What do you want? Get out of my truck, I'm armed." My voice shook but came out loud. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He just leaned forward slightly, like closing the space between us was the only thing on his mind. I reached up, flipped on the cabin light. He blinked at the sudden brightness. And in that split second, I lunged for the driver's door, yanked it open, and dropped down into the lot so fast I nearly twisted my ankle. I ran around to the back, fumbling my phone out of my pocket with shaking hands, dialing 911 before my feet even stopped moving. My voice was loud enough to draw the convenience store clerk out for a smoke, his eyes narrowing when he saw me. "There's someone in my truck," I told him, my words spilling over each other. He got in while I was asleep. The clerk's expression changed instantly, and he turned toward the cab as if expecting to see the man sitting there still. Police arrived 10 minutes later. They searched the truck top to bottom, the lot, the surrounding road. He was gone. The passenger door was cracked open, just enough to let in the night air. No forced entry, nothing stolen. But the floor had footprints, smudged, damp, different tread than my boots. The officers said maybe a transient, maybe someone hiding from the law, slipping into unlocked trucks to sleep or worse. I drove out of that lot without stopping again that night, the adrenaline pushing me farther down the road than I'd planned, my eyes flicking to the mirrors every minute. Since then, I've never once left my truck unlocked, not even for a quick bathroom break. I've wired motion sensors, an interior camera, even a small alarm that goes off if the door opens. Because I learned something that night on the road. In those empty places, it's not the ghosts you need to be afraid of. It's the people who open your door without a sound. I'd been driving alone for hours that night, carrying a load of electronic components across long, empty stretches of desert highway. It was the kind of cargo that didn't draw attention, at least. That's what I thought. I stopped once on the outskirts of a small city to fuel up, grabbed a coffee, stretched my legs under the fluorescent glare of the gas station lights, then got back behind the wheel a little before 2 in the morning. That's the last moment I remember feeling completely at ease. The road beyond the city was dark and quiet, wind pushing lightly against the side of the trailer, my headlights carving out just enough space to keep me moving forward. 3 hours later, I pulled into a remote rest stop, shut off the engine, and crawled into the bunk for a quick nap. Nothing unusual. No strange vehicles in the lot, no one hanging around. When the sun broke over the horizon, I got back on the road. It was only when I rounded a bend on a flat stretch of highway that I noticed it. A gray SUV in my mirror, maybe 100 meters back. At first, I barely paid attention. I'd seen hundreds of gray SUVs, but something about the way it held its distance started to crawl under my skin. It didn't pass me, didn't fall back, didn't change lanes. Every time I glanced in the mirror, there it was, steady as a shadow. An hour passed, then another. I sped up. It matched me. I slowed down. It slowed down too. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. I tested it again, took an unplanned turn into a truck stop. No signal lights, no warning. The SUV continued straight down the highway. I waited 5 minutes, my hand still gripping the wheel, telling myself it was nothing. Then I pulled out again. 10 minutes later, I looked in the mirror, and there it was. Same gray SUV, same distance, like it had been waiting for me to get back on the road. The hairs on my neck were standing straight by then. I kept driving, eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirror. Finally, I made my move another sharp turn, this time into a small dirt lot off the side of the highway, well away from the main road. I cut the lights, shut off the engine, and pulled the curtain closed. My plan was simple. Wait, see if it followed. 5 minutes, 10. The lot was silent, the air still. Then came the crunch of tires on gravel, slow, deliberate. Headlights swept across the side of my cab, bright for a moment before stopping dead. I eased the curtain back an inch and looked out. The gray SUV was parked about 50 meters away, facing my truck. I couldn't see the driver. The windshield was a black void. The license plate was smeared with mud, just enough to blur the numbers. We sat there like that, unmoving. I tried to think through my options, my hand hovering near the glove box where I kept pepper spray. Then, without warning, the SUV reversed slowly, turned around, and rolled back toward the highway until its taillights were swallowed by the dark. I stayed put for another 15 minutes before, worked up the nerve to start the engine again. By the time I reached my destination later that day, I'd convinced myself it was over, that maybe I'd been imagining the worst. But when I stepped out to do a quick walk around before unloading, my stomach dropped. On the lower edge of the trailer's rear right door was a long, shallow scratch, fresh, running from one side of the latch to the other. Not from traffic, not from a branch, the kind of mark left by someone, testing a pry bar or crowbar to see if they could get in. I called it in immediately. The loading crew checked the container top to bottom, nothing missing. The police told me it might have been a cargo theft crew, the kind that shadows trucks for miles, waiting for the right moment to break in or take the whole rig. Maybe I didn't stop long enough. Maybe they saw the load wasn't worth the risk. Either way, they'd been close enough to leave their mark. Now, whenever a car lingers in my mirror too long, I notice. I notice the distance, the timing, the way they move when I move. And I never forget the sight of those headlights in the dark steady, patient, waiting for me to make a mistake.